Three, two, one.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all very much. My name is Peter Bunton. I'm Vice President of the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, and we are very much looking forward to hearing our guest speaker tonight, Dominique Jean-Louis, and the title of her talk is Traces of Our Story at the Center for Brooklyn History. First, for those of you not familiar with the Underground Railroad Consortium, a little quick introduction. We were founded in 2015, and ERCNES is committed to exploring and promoting the stories of freedom seekers who were making their journey both from within and outside the state to freedom. And we welcome those historic sites and programs who tell the stories of these brave freedom seekers and those who helped them on their way. Fourth, 200th anniversary of ERCNES and the Freedom 2027 effort by going to our website, www.ercnes.com. And here tonight we have, you've heard a couple of folks already here from representing ERCNES, and Sage is handling all of our technical programs. So Dominique Jean-Louis has a Ph.D. and she's the chief historian of the Center for Brooklyn Family History Research and the Legacy of Slavery in Brooklyn. And also recently in a collaboration, a pop-up exhibition entitled Memories Matter. Previously, Dominique held the position of Associate Curator of History Exhibitions at the New York Historical. She received her Ph.D. in U.S. History from New York University, and with her doctoral research focusing on race, ethnicity, and the immigration in post-civil rights era Brooklyn schools.
Referring to it as such in the future, let me just make sure my screen is ready to share. All right, perfect. So hopefully you all are seeing presentation. Could I get a thumbs up if it's showing up on the screen?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So as the introduction said, my name is Dominique Jean-Louis. I'm the chief historian at the Center for Brooklyn History. And in case that's not ringing a bell, it might and also, as this presentation tonight will share, we also are a physical home for public history in Brooklyn. So we, of course, have education programs which bring us out into Brooklyn classrooms across the borough. We host public programs every week that expound on not just Brooklyn history, but topics relevant to Brooklynites, civic participation, democracy, cutting edge issues of today. And then where I come in is our exhibitions program. So I joined the Center for Brooklyn History in 2023 and was given the dream task of coming up with an exhibition to curate for the center. So, and I was basically given carte blanche. I could talk about any topic I wanted to. And so I knew basically from the beginning that as a Brooklyn historian, someone who had researched Brooklyn for my dissertation, I had found in talking about Brooklyn that many people didn't know that slavery even took place in Brooklyn. And that not knowing is not necessarily anyone's fault. There are no public monuments to the enslaved that existed in Kings County or in the borough of Brooklyn, and before that, the city of Brooklyn. And it's not necessarily part of the school curriculum, although it probably should be. And so most people go about their days, especially in neighborhoods like Gowanus and Flatbush and Crown Heights, and never know that the ground beneath their feet not only was the home to plantations where farm plantations where produce was grown and made by enslaved people to be sold over in the city of New York, but that slavery was very common, as we'll learn further on in the talk. A huge percentage of Brooklynites at the time were enslaved, and Brooklyn was actually second only to Charleston, South Carolina, in terms of the ratio of unenslaved people to or free white people to enslaved people. So one of the goals I absolutely had for this exhibition was to share that piece of history, not to make anyone feel down or feel guilty, but to have a more full understanding of the place where they live. We're lucky enough in Brooklyn where things are always being built, new communities are always being, declared hot and up and coming. But I think that very exciting reality can sometimes obscure very rich history and history that dates very far back, hundreds of years ago. And certainly this exhibition is very much in keeping with and had in mind the 200-year anniversary of the abolition of slavery in New York State that's upcoming in 2027. So, like any historian, of course, I wanted to go to the source. Oh, here's the card of the exhibition, and I will share. It's very exciting for me to be giving this talk this evening, considering that tomorrow night we're going to be opening a new exhibition in the space where traces family history research and the legacy of slavery in Brooklyn in that same gallery space. So this exhibition came down at the end of August, and we've since curated another exhibition on Brooklyn politics to go in its place. So this presentation is letting me relive what a special exhibition this was and how much meaning it had to share it with Brooklyn. So, like any historian, when you're taking on a topic, of course, you want to share. Well, when we really have a patient East River from Manhattan, we can probably guess that the first enslaved people were brought to Brooklyn quite shortly thereafter. So the 1620s is kind of when we're assuming the first enslaved person would have, stepped foot on Brooklyn soil. But of course, slavery takes a while to not only appear one person one time, but to really become part of the system, part of the bedrock of Brooklyn society. And so, looking in our New York State archives, there are a number of documents that are in a ground zero moment. This is a place in kind of stark black and white, I would say in plain English, but of course it's written in Dutch, where we have this moment where slavery is kind of first authorized. So the legislation kind of shares, or Peter Stuyvesant kind of decrees that the inhabitants of New Netherland shall be at liberty to purchase Negroes wheresoever they may, sorry, this is from the Dutch West India Company, this isn't Stuyvesant. They shall be at liberty to purchase Negroes wheresoever they may think necessary, except on the coast of Guinea, and bring them into New Netherland to work on their boweries. And for this exhibition, we really asked people to hone in on three parts of that decree. So the first is to purchase Negroes. So from the very beginning, from the 1650s, the category of enslavement or the status of enslavement was tied to the racial identity of being Black. We do know that, of course, elsewhere in the Caribbean and specifically by the Dutch. So we kind of give people a ground zero moment here, in part because we also want to give a sense of the longevity. 1652 is almost 400 years ago. That for almost is not really a place yet. It's of course the western end of Long Island, but it's really a conglomeration of different villages. So much so that census data will separate Kings County into these different, what will become Kings County, into these separate villages. We have in our collection, we're lucky enough to have the 1786 census. Of course, this isn't a federal census. 1786 is not a census year, but Kings County kind of just took its own inventory of who was living in Brooklyn at the time, which of course in 1786 is going to be a lot of slave owners. So in fact, about 40% of families in New York before slavery ends are going to be slave owning families. And this 1786 census, which by the way is a single sheet of paper, and we were able to share that with visitors in the original. It's remarkably well preserved, but very usefully for us, this document, as we just saw, only has a couple of columns, and the very last column is going to be your total number of enslaved people in each of the original villages of Brooklyn. And it so happens that the total number of white inhabitants is right next to it. So it's almost like they knew, it's almost like they knew in 1786 that we were going to be interested in those ratios here, 300 years later, nearly, 200 some odd years later, that we were going to be interested in these ratios. And they're pretty staggering, particularly in the village of Flatbush. And I just included a rough breakdown of how Brooklyn was broken up into those original villages. So when you look at the village of Flatbush, which also encompasses today's Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, we can see, where's our Flatbush, that we have a total of 255 white inhabitants and 223 enslaved inhabitants. So that was such a stark and striking example to be able to offer visitors side by side. If you were to time travel to Flatbush in 1786, you're about as likely to run into an enslaved person as you are to run into a white person. So that gives you a sense that slavery didn't just happen in Brooklyn or happen to exist in Brooklyn. It's really a defining part of a lot of the original villages that make up what we call Brooklyn today. So going back into the New York State archives, diving into our own archives is, of course, where you start if you know you want to do an exhibition about slavery. But it was very important to me that this feel grounded in a human experience, that when we study slavery, as we're looking at this list of numbers right here, there can be a tendency to look at statistics and raw numbers, and it's very hard to connect to the human experience. And of course, what slavery was a human experience, and specifically a dehumanizing one, where we reduce human beings to less than human status. And so what we decided to do, or what I decided to do, was tie it into a family story. How can genealogy, something that, frankly, if the majority of people who are interested in history, or at least who come to our research institution, a lot of them are very interested in genealogy. That's one of the top, if not the top, research requests we get. So we know that this is a real draw for people who are curious about history. But of course, if they're lucky, everyone has a family. And so this is an entry point for people to be able to understand how this big institution that involves all of these hundreds of people, how can we understand it on a human level and kind of go back in time 200, 300 years ago. So we decided not only to engage that family notice because of these numbers, but also we have so little or so few firsthand accounts of what slavery was like from the enslaved. Here is one of the only ones I know of, and we're going to talk about the other one that we know of that we kind of based this whole exhibition on. This is a memoir based on John Jay, the African preacher. So John Jay is born enslaved, and eventually itinerant life, and actually rested easier than many households had. Just a hand quotes like this one, firsthand primary sources do such an excellent job of delivering a rejoinder to that misperception. No, there was agricultural slavery in Brooklyn. It was incredibly strenuous, and it was literally valued as it had less of a value than the labor of livestock. So we do have very spare examples of firsthand of what it was like for the enslaved. But we also have family history to draw us to. And this is just a piece of a material we have in our collection. This is a family tree of the Lot family. This is one of the original Dutch settlers of Brooklyn. They all trace their ancestry back to a single Dutch colonist named Tunis Bergen. And this is just like a segment of it. We actually have to push two research tables together to hold this family tree. It's about 10 feet long. But this family is going to tell us a lot about both family history and also the history of the enslaved, because like many of the original Dutch settler families in Brooklyn, the Lot family are enslavers. So specifically, this exhibition discusses and features this portrait of a man named John A. Lot. So you heard me say that slavery begins in Brooklyn in the early 17th century, but we're focusing in this exhibition in basically slavery's final days, right? At the kind of last dying gasps of the institution. And indeed, by the time John A. Lott is born, gradual emancipation has begun, right? Starting in 1799, we start that process of gradual emancipation, but it's not full emancipation yet, and John Lott is born into a slave-owning household of his parents, Abraham and Maria Lott. And so John A. Lott, the reason that this lovely portrait and its, rococo, gilded frame, the reason we have it is he's this very prominent individual, specifically in the history of the village of Flatbush, but to Brooklyn overall. So, in part because he's born into a wealthy slave owning family, he's given every opportunity in life. He receives an excellent education at Erasmus Hall. He goes on to become first a lawyer in private practice and then elevates to local judgeship and eventually all the way up to state judgeship. So, we have this portrait in our collection at the Center for Brooklyn History. Another portrait, and I should share, it's hard to see on the screen. This portrait is 40 inches by 50 inches. It's almost life size. Another portrait with similar dimensions, painted by the same artist, Thomas Jensen, sits in Borough Hall, which used to be Brooklyn City Hall, just around the corner for the Center for Brooklyn History, representing his importance to the city of Brooklyn. Another similar size portrait hangs in the state courts in Albany, because he was so important in New York State. So this is someone who is incredibly well known and well regarded in his time as a legal mind, as a stately man. And even, looking at this portrait, if I hadn't told you any of this, or if you couldn't see the text, you have the visual cues of how important this man is. He's surrounded by legal textbooks in this portrait. He's very well dressed. We even see the gold watch fob. He's got a little bling. This is clearly a well-to-do man that is, commands respect. So I mentioned that he's born into a slave-owning family in 1806. Someone else who was born into that same household is a young boy named Samuel Anderson. Samuel Anderson and John A. Lott are peers, except Samuel Anderson is born enslaved. He is born in 1810, so he's just 4 years younger than John. The Lott family is very large. Pardon the pun, there are a lot of Lotts. So Samuel Anderson is born into the household of John A. Lott's uncle, Jeremiah Lott, who, kind of gross alert, becomes his father-in-law because John A. Lott marries his first cousin, Catherine Lott. Just a little gross, not that uncommon back in this day. But it is also a piece of evidence that Jeremiah Lott and John A. Lott were very close, and John A. Lott probably spent his childhood going back and forth between his family's farm in Flatbush and his uncle's farm in Flatbush. They were very close together. They attended the same Dutch Reformed church. And would have almost certainly encountered Samuel Anderson. They're a similar age. They're in households within the same family. These two boys knew each other. And Samuel Anderson, here in 1898, so he's 88 years old when this interview is given, he's interviewed by the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. By this time, slavery has been over for more than 70 years, and they kind of have this interview as a human interest piece, kind of like, oh gosh, this old guy still remembers back in the slavery days. Can you believe it? But because they did this kind of funny human interest story, and they're referring to Uncle Sammy's cottage, and it's very quaint, they're also letting Samuel Anderson speak his firsthand account. I mentioned John Jay is one of the only sources we know of. This is one of the only others. And not only that, but Samuel Anderson did me a personal favor because he was so specific and exacting about the household he belongs to. I was born in 1810. My master was Jeremiah. He was the uncle of Judge John A. Lott. So if I had any misgivings about, are these the same? Is this the same Lotts I'm thinking of? Because they're all named John and Jeremiah and Abraham. But he lays it out, not only who owned him, and I didn't have this highlighted as well, but in this whole fairly long article from 1898, he actually spends very little of it talking about being enslaved, even though that is the reason he's being interviewed. That's the reason for the article. He spends the entire rest of the article talking about what he did with his freedom when he became free after slavery ends in New York State in 1827. He converted to a different form of Christianity. He got married. He had 12 children, and he got to see most of them live to adulthood. He gardened, and he had favorite crops he liked to garden, and favorite things he liked to eat. He lived a whole life, and he got to speak. The chance he got is the chance that so few enslaved people did, which was to explain that the fact that he had been born enslaved was not the most important thing to know about him. He was a man who had a whole life. And so this is not only an incredibly powerful primary source document, but it also opened the door for us to tell an even more exciting story about family genealogy than even the Lott's family tree, that 10 feet long one, because we were able, oh, sorry, and here's the evidence. I tracked down the 1810 census or 1820 census that shows where the tallies of the lot enslaved people appear in the schedule for the 1820 census. But because we have this information about Samuel Anderson, we were able to track down his descendants. So his great great grandson, Augustus, who is Augustus Wilson, who is pictured here, was a passionate genealogist. He historical record. Anyone who does genealogy, this is the holy grail. This is what you're looking for. Your ancestor being able to talk to you from history. Towards the end, he's talking about his children that he raised. These are Gus's great grandparents. I remember I have memories of my great grandparents. Tracking down Samuel Anderson's descendants also allows us to make a crucial point that slavery was not that long ago. This isn't ancient history. This is Brooklynites you might encounter at Atlantic Avenue. Their great grandparents are mentioned in articles about slavery. This is quite recent, almost living history. So sadly, before we started work on this exhibition, Gus had already passed away. We were connected with his story through the current OGS, African American Historical and Genealogical Society, OGS New York. Their current membership were able to connect us with this story and eventually connect us with Gus's sister, Mildred. And we asked Mildred if she would be willing to sit for a portrait to convey that family story and also to her ancestors, including Samuel Anderson. While this portrait was being painted, I took this picture, so I'm sitting behind our portrait artist, Rusty Zimmerman. I'm also conducting an oral history with Mildred. So while her portrait's being painted, we're asking her about what it means to live with this legacy. And she very poignantly says, these are my roots. This is where I'm from. This is who we are. We've been here a long time, and we actually chose to blow this up as a big quote in the exhibition because she really says it all right there, right? That Brooklyn is so associated with migration, right? About 40% of Brooklynites are foreign born, which means an even greater percentage belong to households where someone was born outside the country. It's almost a joke at this point about transplants and people who just got here. Brooklyn is associated with being a destination, but there are Brooklynites, Mildred being one of them, born and raised in Bed-Stuy. Her family has been in Brooklyn since enslavement. These are the only roots they can really connect to firsthand. And so in the exhibition, we were able to place these two portraits side by side and let visitors really confront, well, what is the legacy of enslavement? Is it the people who profited off of slavery and were able to build legacies of wealth and influence and being celebrated? Or is it the people who you might pass at the train station never knowing that their story of Brooklyn heritage is equally as important to the history of the borough and possibly even more so? So having these portraits side by side, making Mildred's portrait possible, was a huge reason why we put together this exhibition. But I knew I didn't want to stop there. It's always, I mean, I'm an educator by heart. I started my curatorial career as a museum educator. I'm the daughter of a public school teacher. I'm always going to want to do a little bit of, education, make a lesson out of anything. So I also wanted to dive back into our collection and bring out some of the collection materials that help us to tell the story of the enslaved. The only firsthand accounts I could find, or I know of, at least yet, of people enslaved in Brooklyn is that Samuel Anderson article and John Jay. There might be more out there. We're excited to discover them if so. But otherwise, what we get, and here's where the title of the exhibition comes in, are these traces of the stories of the enslaved. So what we're looking at here is a painting in our collection by an artist named James Van Brunt, and this is his grandfather Cornelius Van Brunt, a slave owner, and their family's plantation in Gowanus. And we can see we have what appears to be African American laborers working on a plantation in Brooklyn. Other kind of also evidence that that slavery in Brooklyn is not just domestic. It's not just, here and there household slavery, that we have large plantation farms that are being worked on, which kind of says it all. We're very lucky to collection to be able to kind of put a visual to what some of the experience of the enslaved might be. But we have very few, this is the only painting we have that depicts this kind of scene. Most of what we have are these documents. And of course, the documents in our collection that tell us about slavery were not made to tell us about slavery. The story. This Irish immigrant named basically every day is writing at least some kind of entry. And I had some help from a researcher named Niall Solomon, who was a huge help in this exhibition. And when Niall was in the archive, I said, we have this journal. Would you please look through it and see if you find anything interesting? And Niall says, well, here's this entry I found that John Baxter went fishing with Jeremiah Lott. And we're doing, the Lott families in this exhibition. And we're talking about Jeremiah Lott. So here's an interesting entry. And they talk about, it's a little hard to see, June 16th, 1806. John Baxter has included, and with lots of circling and underlining, the Great Eclipse. A solar eclipse happens a couple of days after that fishing trip. And John Baxter writes it in his journal because for him, that solar eclipse happened to him. That's a cool thing that he saw. But we know from this document, those enslaved men also saw that solar eclipse. What was their impression of it? Because as a historian, the first thing I thought of when Niall was showing me this fishing trip, owners, they know they're outnumbered. They know what they're doing is wrong. They know what they're doing might inspire violence. It is through oppression that they're keeping these uprisings from happening. But that's after the Haitian Revolution. They understand that these kinds of uprisings are possible. It didn't happen in Brooklyn this time. These enslaved men who were fishing with the Lotts and with John Baxter didn't happen to take up arms, not that we know of, but knowing that that very same event was the kickoff of a huge event that really helped to accelerate the break about the issue of slavery, the Civil War itself, because the South really starts to clamp down on limiting the movement and limiting the freedom of enslaved people or Black people more generally, because they fear the violence that someone like Nat Turner was able to enact because he saw a solar eclipse. It's such a moment of what could have happened, what didn't in this instance, but did, 30 years later in a different state. So documents like this weren't intended for us to make those connections, but these traces of the lives of the enslaved help us to kind of make some really interesting connections and thoughts. Now, of course, most of the material or much of the material we have representing slavery in our collection are bills of sale, right? We have no shortage of these kinds of documents, which of course were not made so we understand the lives of the enslaved. They're made as a document. This is a legal document, the same way you sign a contract and keep a copy in that one drawer that you never really clean out because you think you might need it someday. Well, those kind of documents here in the early 19th century end up in the collection of then the Long Island Historical Society, before it's the Brooklyn Historical Society, now it's the Center for Brooklyn History. And the reason we included this particular one in the exhibition is we knew if we put up this, we reproduced this image at larger than life so people could easily read the text. If we put this image of a bill of sale in front of a bunch of Brooklynites, these are names they would know very well. Jeremiah Vanderbilt, Sarah Bergen. These are the names of our subway stops, our busiest thoroughfares. This bill of sale, even though it's a sale of a man named Frank, we don't get a lot of information about him. We don't know what happens to him. We don't even have a last name. While this is, the sad reality of this document is that this 24-year-old young man is being sold. We are also seeing how sales like this one lead to the kind of stratification of wealth that we see in Brooklyn. These families are the ones that go on to become,
No problem, no problem.
There we go. Can people hear me again? Peter, am I here? Okay, there we go. These same names are everywhere in our civic centers and in our arts institutions, in our streets and our subway stop. So this document helps us make the connection that, slave owners weren't just families who lived a long time ago who did a bad thing, slavery generates wealth, and that wealth is generational, and that wealth translates to influence. It translates to politicians who are able to craft and vote for policy that help out their family, help out the wealthy, and make things very difficult for those who didn't get that generational leg up, but of coming from a dynasty of slave owners. So we really got so his children are left orphanage, and all of their worldly possessions kind of need to go to a kind of interlocutor, someone who's going to kind of manage their affairs until their children become of age. So everything that Jerome's Ryerson owns, from his one horse to his frying pan, it's got to be inventoried, and the value has to be listed. So amongst these entries for one large kettle and one bridle, we see one Negro wench. And that's upsetting language. That's not language we would ever use today, but we include it in part because that's descriptive language. It's not put there to be a pejorative. It's put there to define her as a woman of childbearing age. And so this price that she's valued at, or this value that she's listed at, is going to be in relation to the fact that her body can produce more enslaved people because she is of childbearing age. So this woman, who is not given a name, who's not given an age, she is not given the dignity of any characteristics that honor her humanity. But what we do know is that she is an investment. She is a commodity with value, the same way that a washing tub is. And so that the starkness of this document is upsetting, but very helpful for understanding both the dehumanization and the stark relationship between human people and value and capital. So inventories like this also are very helpful storytellers for putting ourselves in a position where we can understand the system that is enslavement. I think this is the last bill of sale that I have listed here, because obviously I don't want to go into every single thing that was in the exhibition. But this one was really striking for me to read. This is the sale of a 9-year-old girl named Mercy. And again, she's being sold by Phoebe Lefferts to Abraham Vanderveer. Other names, Isaac Cortelliu is a witness. These are names that are very known as Brooklyn neighborhoods, as different regions, the Lefferts house in Prospect Park. So again, we have that familiarity. It's stirring and upsetting that it's a young girl that's being sold. It is horribly ironic that this girl's name is Mercy, right? And the fact of her sale is showing no sign of mercy towards her. But why I like this document to put in this exhibition, the story that it tells, is because, obviously, parchment, paper, ink, it's not super expensive, but it's not cheap. If you make a mistake in 1814, you're not going to crumble up the paper and throw it away. You're just going to, cross out here and there. You're going to add a word that you forgot to add. You're just going to edit it. You're not really going to start over. There's no point in it. So what we have here is basically a document we can kind of read being created in real time. We can see that someone's gone back and said, oh, child named Mercy. Oh, we're going to put this descriptor here. And one of those edits is really fascinating to me. And that is this one that I've highlighted here, where Phoebe, the seller, is promising to Abraham, the buyer, that Mercy will, in all lawful business, shall honestly, orderly, and obediently in all things bemean herself towards her said master and all his during the said term. And then someone has gone back and added, and behave, bemean and behave herself towards her said master. Why? Why bother making that addition? Did Phoebe think about this sale and say, you know what, Mercy is just the most well-behaved girl. I feel perfectly comfortable putting it in writing that she will always behave herself towards her said master because she always has. I'm going to put that in writing. Or is Mercy an especially unruly 9-year-old, and Abraham takes one look at her and says, you better put it in writing that this child is going to behave herself if I'm going to give you this money for her. And moreover, we'll never know the answer to why that addition was being made. But what is striking is that these adults have convinced themselves that they can promise in a legal document signed and sealed about the behavior of a 9-year-old. I have a 9-year-old niece, Sasha. You cannot tell from one day to the next what Sasha is going to do, let alone sign your name to a legal document promising her behavior. This is a farce of a document. This is ridiculous, and it shows the kind of self-delusion that is necessary to uphold a system like slavery. It's a lie. It's built on a lie. One human person cannot belong to another. If you are a human individual, you belong to yourself. But in order to create a system and an institution where human beings can be bought, sold, and owned, you have to convince yourself that you have supreme power over not just what happens to them and what household they reside in and what price is placed on that movement, but their very behavior, their very personhood is up to you. And that's impossible, but they needed to believe this in order for any of the system to work. I find this to be an upsetting document, but also a very revealing one in terms of how much do you have to delude yourself, lie amongst yourselves, declare legally true things that could never be true in order to uphold a system that is so greedily benefits you and dehumanizes someone else in an entire category of person to a less than human status. So while this is a bill of sale, it is also, I think, an indictment on an entire system that really defines Brooklyn for almost 200 years. So considering the family genealogical angle, we were able to get that portrait painted of Mildred and include her family story, and of course Gus's as well. But they're not the only genealogists who have ever existed. We worked in really close tandem with Oggs New York, really had a partnership with them to put on this exhibition and got to feature the stories of some of their members. And none of them had stories that we featured that were like Mildred's in terms of tracing their ancestry to slavery in Brooklyn, but they had really fascinating stories to tell us about how Black people end up in Brooklyn. So Muriel, she goes by Dee Roberts, traces her ancestry to both Black communities in Brooklyn, but also Indigenous ones. And in fact, she has this incredible document that's been passed down by her family about her Indigenous ancestors. And we featured it in the exhibition, but of course, we didn't acquire it. It's not appropriate for that to be in the Center for Brooklyn History. That belongs to her. That's for her family to safeguard. But at least now, we were able to do a little conservation of it, get a high-res scan, so they're able to preserve this document within their family digitally and physically a little bit better. I want to wrap because we're running low on time, just with Stacy because she's very near and dear to my heart. Stacy and I were really partners throughout this exhibition. She was kind of my tutor in all things genealogical. Genealogists have a lot to teach historians. They're two different skill sets, and I was really, I learned a lot from her. But the funny story that's related to how she's featured in the exhibition is that you can tell I'm running late now. I'm a talker. Stacy's a talker. Our meetings would always run late. And her husband would always, come pick her up in his car. And we're in the middle of Brooklyn Heights. There's no parking. He'd be like honking his horn outside. Like, she's on the phone with him, like, give me. He's like, there's no parking. I'm going to get a ticket. So I got to see that they have this really great kind of bickering relationship. And one of the reasons is because they're childhood sweethearts. They've known each other their entire lives. But over the course of doing the exhibition, and we share her story in the exhibition, and I'm not going to go fully through it now so we have time for questions. But in her work as a genealogist, she's able to trace her family story, but also her husband's family story, and thus the genealogy of her children, and show, well, why is it that they both ended up in the same neighborhood in Bensonhurst in the 1960s and 70s? The story of why they're childhood sweethearts, why they met in the first place, where their families were in the same place, is actually a great migration story. And two different great migration stories, being pulled north by opportunity or being pushed from the south because of violence. But these great migration stories that we now that have helped create a Brooklyn that's so closely associated with Blackness, whether that's via the Great Migration, whether that's via Caribbean and African immigration, or whether that's via families like Mildred's that trace their ancestry all the way back to slavery in Brooklyn. These are stories that we take for granted of skins and do the work of, well, why are they here? And each one of the stories of how someone arrives in Brooklyn is as rich as Mildred's or as Stacy's or any of these folks. So I'm going to pause it here. We end the exhibition with a little bit more about, well, what happens in Brooklyn after slavery ends. There's some interesting tidbits in there that if there's time, we can chat a little bit more about. But I'll close how I opened. It just feels really good to get to live inside the world of this exhibition, since it's currently down, and another exhibition, the history of slavery and bulls in the family of us. Some questions, you'll be able to listen in on that podcast. I work with a former student of mine who is fantastic and an excellent podcaster. So that's one way that you can access this exhibition now that it's done. I'm seeing a question about the Van Brunt painting. So this is in the what's now the neighborhood of Gowanus. And actually, you can see, I shouldn't have stopped sharing so fast. In the distance in that painting, you can actually see the old. I had the privilege of going on a Black History walking tour of Lower Manhattan, led by fantastic activist Miriam Kaba, and she had some excellent historical stories and locations built out about David Ruggles and downtown New York as like a site of slavery and abolition. So definitely recommend checking out her work and other walking tours down there. And yes, the recording is going to be available via Euclid. A little too fast, you can pause and grab a phrase or take a closer look at some of the archival and primary source documents. So I think I probably missed some. I scrolled a little fast. Were there any other questions before we drive it to a close, or we could just chat about David Ruggles for the rest of this time, because certainly he is a fascinating individual. That I just earlier before this talk was talking to teen historians at the New York Historical and about an exhibition that I did there on Frederick Douglass. And of course, Frederick Douglass was married in the living room of David Ruggles after he and Anna Marie Douglass escaped to New York. So David Ruggles is all over New York City Black history.
Can we just ask a question? I don't know.
Yes, the floor is open now. Go right away and ask your question. Introduce yourself first, please.
My name is Faustenia Morrow. I'm in the Buffalo, New York area, and I'm curious to know if you were able to make any connections to the Brooklynites, and then I think it's called Trinity Church in Manhattan near Battery Park, where there are enslaved or freedom seekers that are buried there, or there's a connection there. Like, were you able to make any connections from the people that you've mentioned to if they inhabited in that area or even in Central Park? And then if they took any journeys on the way up to upstate and maybe crossed over into Canada through Buffalo or somehow in that area?
Excellent question. The answer requires a long stretch of Brooklyn's history, because I can say that the period that we researched for this exhibition, when slavery was still thriving in Brooklyn, we didn't really see many connections between the enslaved in Manhattan and the enslaved in Brooklyn. Now, of course, we know there are many reasons why any of those connections wouldn't necessarily have been written down, have been saved. So it's certainly not conclusive to say those connections didn't happen, but rather that we don't see as much of that evidence in the historical record. But in the period after slavery ends in New York, but especially before it ends in the rest of the country via the Civil War, we absolutely see connections between Seneca Village and Brooklyn. Specifically, I'm thinking of Marisha Lyons, whose father, Albro Lyons, I always forget the order of the R and the L. They lived in Brooklyn, in fact, in Weeksville, which many of you will be familiar with, but they owned property in Seneca Village. So we know that at least that connection existed. And then, of course, when the draft riots happen in 1863 in New York City, it's terrifying for Black New Yorkers, and many of them flee, never come back. New York lost about 30% of its Black population, and many of those numbers went over to Brooklyn because, of course, Brooklyn is its own city at that time. So leaving Manhattan for Brooklyn meant moving to a new city, and many of them ended up settling in Weeksville. And in fact, Caitlin Greenidge, the novelist, part of her novel Liberty captures exactly that fact. And because I used to work at Weeksville, There were absolutely families who started making their way out of Brooklyn. Some of them had been enslaved in Brooklyn and then moved their families north. Some of them came up from the south, stopped in Brooklyn, and then continued up north. But the Weeksville Heritage Society, yes, I believe that's right. Regional Historical Society, their full name, in their collections, they have terrific letters between Weeksville inhabitants and those who have moved on. Really moving ones I'll never forget. Like, it's good in Canada, girl. Like, forget it. I know you're trying to make America work, but here's where the answer is: just get out of the country. And so we definitely see those connections of those who gave it up and those who decided to stay and fight. And that's not a judgment on either. But those connections absolutely exist throughout the rest of the 19th century. And I'll just sneak in an answer here because I know we're going over time. The maximum enslaved population of Brooklyn, the number is tricky. I find that the 1786 census is a good guide. So that number is around 1,300. It probably swells to a little larger than that between 1786 and 1827 when slavery ends. So, and of course, not every enslaved person is going to be captured by a pretty unofficial census. So I would say it's probably going to be about 1,500 people, or between 1,500 and 2,000 at its peak before slavery ends in Brooklyn is where my guess would be. But of course, the exact numbers would be very difficult to know. And also, again, Brooklyn wasn't its own city yet or its own place yet. So the kind of enslaved population between Long Island and Queens and Brooklyn is also going to be a little amorphous at that time period. So where the lines are drawn is also going to be a little hard to differentiate.
Being city.
I think definitely more of an effort is being made. I'm actually not sure if it's mandatory yet. And of course, we have a mix of parochial and public and private schools in New York. So I do know that there are a number of schools that have a little bit more say-so over their curriculum, are making it a point to include this material in their teaching, and in fact often use our collections to do so. But I also have to give credit where it's due. In 2004, the New York Historical had a landmark exhibition called Slavery in New York. The website for that still exists. It's a very 2004 website, so don't expect the heights of technology. But they did excellent research around that, and I think in 2004 is really when the public consciousness around the history of slavery, specifically in New York City, when it really starts to heighten. But to your point about growing up in Brooklyn, that exhibition really focuses, understandably on New York City, given New York City was just Manhattan back in those days. So the research about the history of slavery in Staten Island and in Brooklyn and in Queens and in the Bronx has been a little bit slower to come to fruition. I'm hoping more historians pick up that mantle, because my guess is some of that gap comes from the fact that there isn't as much extant research. I couldn't give you a book on the history of slavery in Brooklyn specifically because there isn't one yet. So some of that is just the gap of the research hasn't been done. And some of that, might just be that not everyone thinks that history should be where people could find it, in our curricula or in our museums in this moment in time.
Can I
Done a great
partially
job.
answer that, Dominique, and
Sure.
also the gap between not knowing and historians' books, which take 5 or 6 or 7 or more years, has to be filled by the public history community, who has access both to some of the original research as well as spade work that they are doing themselves in their community.
Absolutely.
For Dutchess County, for us, the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery, we have done a lot of spade work, and we relied on other people. Fergus Bordowich, other folks who have done work that tangentially relates to the Mid-Hudson area. So we have a role to play, and a lot of people on this call are in the field of public history. And Judy, just quickly, invariably, when we talk or do an exhibit, the audience did not know there was enslavement in New York.
Yeah, I agree. I think people are working on it, but I think the knowledge gap is still there. The work still needs to be done because I think the people who know, and we want more people to know,
Yep.
but most people are still like, you mean there was slavery in Brooklyn? And, we can only keep, chipping away at public perception.
Yep. Any other questions from the audience? Well, not hearing any. Dominique, we want to thank you so much. And we all could have listened to a lot more of those traces and looked at all of those individual pieces that you can use to put together a whole picture of the story of enslavement in Brooklyn. So thank you very much. And for all of our attendees, thank you. Hi, Nans. This recording will be on the Euclid's website shortly. And for those of you who missed it or want to watch it again or refer someone to it, you can go to www.erknees.org, which is the site of our Underground Railroad, and you'll be able to find it there. So thank you all very much for coming. We wish you a good all again